Debate.
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to express my profound disappointment with the Liberal government's decision to gut legislation intended to protect Canadians from genetic discrimination. Now, such legislation is essential to ensure that Canadians can make use of genetic testing without fear to improve their healthcare planning and treatment options. With approximately 48,000 genetic tests now available, no Canadian should have to forego using these critical tools because they lack effective legal protection from discrimination. But that is exactly what this Liberal government has decided Canadians will have to suffer. The original version of Bill S-201 proposed to make amendments to the Canada Labour Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act while introducing a series of new offences and penalties for genetic discrimination in a standalone act and to prevent discrimination in contracts and the provision of goods and services. But the Liberal government's amendments to Bill S-201 have deleted all provisions forbidding mandatory genetic testing and mandatory disclosure of test results, as well as proposed employee protections under the Canada Labour Code. The only provision remaining from the original version of Bill S-201 would make genetic characteristics a discriminatory motive under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, currently, there is no law in place that protects Canadians' genetic privacy. This puts Canada out of step with its major industrial counterparts. By eviscerating Bill S-201, the Liberal government is maintaining a serious legislative gap on genetic discrimination that doesn't exist in any of our G7 partners. Canada's New Democrats agree that the federal government can and must do more to provide comprehensive protection from genetic discrimination for every Canadian. That's why we strongly supported Bill S-201 when it was first introduced in the House. That's why New Democrat MPs introduced similar legislation on 3 previous occasions. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has utterly neutered Bill S-201 and, more importantly, the rights of all Canadians by eliminating the first ever nationwide protections and penalties against genetic discrimination. Let's take a closer look at exactly what this Liberal government is proposing to do to this bill. The original version of 201 would have enacted a new statute, the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, prohibiting any requirement that forces an individual to take a genetic test or disclose the results of a genetic test. Further, it would have prohibited anyone from collecting or using the results of a person's genetic test without the person's written consent as a condition of providing goods or services to the person, entering into or continuing a contract with the person, or offering or continuing particular terms or conditions in a contract with the person. Researchers and practitioners providing health services would have been exempt from this aspect of the legislation. The original version of S-201 would have made changes to the Canada Labour Code to prohibit federally regulated employers from taking disciplinary action against an employee because the employee refused the employer's request to take a genetic test or reveal the results of a previous test. The original bill would have also amended federal privacy legislation to make it clear that personal information includes information derived from genetic testing. Breaking the law would have been a criminal offence punishable by fines and imprisonment. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the original bill would have provided Canadians with protection against discrimination on the basis of their genetic makeup. It would have protected Canadians from being forced to disclose genetic information to insurance companies and their employers. But this Liberal government has stripped those protections from this bill. In doing so, it is important to note that the Liberals are ignoring, indeed countermanding, the overwhelming weight of testimony at both the House Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights and the Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights. Before both bodies, the vast majority of witnesses supported this legislation as originally proposed. This view was echoed by the Canadian Coalition for Genetic Fairness, a diverse alliance of organizations that advocate on behalf of the families directly affected by genetic conditions, folks who are witnessing the disturbing prevalence of genetic discrimination firsthand. As stated, the only provision that the Liberal government has chosen to maintain is to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to include genetic characteristics as a prohibited ground of discrimination. Now, unfortunately, this provision is arguably the weakest of the protections contained in the original text of the bill. As Marie-Claude Landry, the Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, told the Justice Committee, quote, "While changing the Canadian Human Rights Act will be a positive step for human rights, it cannot address all the concerns surrounding genetic discrimination. There will still be a clear need to address the very real and serious fears of discrimination raised during the Senate debate, fears about test results being used against us, and fears for our children. We believe that in order to properly address these concerns, it is going to take a concerted, comprehensive national approach." Mr. Speaker, this is deeply disappointing to all those who believe in rights. It will create fear that Canadians will not qualify for insurance coverage. It will compel employees to provide their employers or prospective employers with personal information that may then be used to deny them employment. Worse, it will cause Canadians to decline to get tested for many conditions to avoid creating a record that may someday be used against them. This will harm Canadians' health and set back critical treatment and research into many genetically influenced diseases. These concerns have been eloquently captured by David Lucadelis, QC, BC's Information and Privacy Commissioner from 1999 to 2010 and Deputy Attorney General from 2010 to 2012. He recently wrote to the member for Edmonton Centre, the sponsor of the amendments to strip the bill of its protections. Quote, "I am deeply disappointed, to say the least, by your motions to gut Bill S-201. Retention of the amendments to the CHRA is laudable as far as that goes, but it is not far enough to address the very real threat posed by genetic discrimination in the workplace, in insurance markets, and in other areas of life. The fear of discrimination on this basis is amply justified. Genetic discrimination is having real-life consequences for Canadians now. It is harming vulnerable Canadian children now. More needs to be done and can be done by Parliament. I am appalled by your complicity in the executive's thwarting of this critically important legislation. The supposed constitutional concerns now being bandied about are a smokescreen and no more, as Peter Hogg has made plain. I call on you to stand up for Canadian children, for all Canadians, by withdrawing your motions and by fighting against discrimination, not supporting it." End quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Justice Minister argues that the original version of the bill is unconstitutional. But when they studied Bill S-201, even the Liberal members of the Senate Human Rights Committee were clear that they heard no convincing evidence supporting the Justice Minister's position. On the contrary, Bill S-201's constitutionality was confirmed by a number of constitutional experts who testified before Parliament, including Peter Hogg, perhaps the leading authority on Canadian constitutional law. One critical piece of evidence reveals in stark manner the nonsense of the government's constitutional excuse. The Liberal government has removed the bill's employment protections from the Canada Labour Code, which applies solely and completely to Canadians in federally regulated jurisdiction. There can be no argument that it is unconstitutional for the federal government to provide protections to federally regulated employees. Yet that is exactly what this Liberal government has done. Mr. Speaker, I submit that rather than acting on constitutional concerns, the Liberal government has clearly caved into pressure from the insurance industry and big business. Disgracefully, the Liberal government has clearly indicated it will favour corporate lobbyists wanting to protect their profits over the human rights of Canadians wanting to protect their rights, privacy, and health. But rather than acquiescing to fear-mongering, Madam Speaker, I'm hoping that every member of this House, including Liberal backbenchers, will actually vote to preserve this bill. And I know that there are good Liberal members on that side of the House that agree with the arguments being made here today. I would end by quoting Tommy Douglas, who told us, "Courage, my friends, 'tis not too late to build a better world." I'm hoping that the Liberal members of this House will do the right thing, stand up for Canadians' human rights, vote against this cynical attempt, this illegitimate attempt to strip this important bill of the very real protections that Canadians need to protect them from genetic discrimination. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.